We expect conflicts to end with a signature on a treaty or a decisive, crushing victory on the battlefield. We expect history to turn on grand, sweeping actions. The reality of the early 2026 negotiations unfolding right now in Geneva is entirely different. These talks are succeeding because of cold, unyielding math. After 4 years of high-intensity friction, the conflict has reached its mathematical limit. Both Kyiv and Moscow are suffering from systemic exhaustion. The calculation on the ground is strict. The daily expenditure and resources required to continue fighting now vastly exceeds the strategic value of any remaining territory to be gained. To understand why these talks are progressing, we have to look past the standard presentation of international diplomacy. We need to evaluate the raw structural foundations of both states, their energy grids, their financial reserves, and their remaining manpower. The current pause in hostilities is a forced structural synchronization between two completely exhausted systems that can no longer sustain a kinetic border war. For decades, Europe operated in a state of geopolitical paralysis. The continent was tethered to a complex web of energy dependencies that gave Moscow massive leverage over Western foreign policy. The Black Sea has transitioned from a naval combat theater into a permanent high-tech energy bridge. Submarine corridors designed to carry electricity and hydrogen from the Caspian region directly to Central Europe now form the invisible skeleton of the current peace deal. This map shows the geographic route of the deep-sea infrastructure. When the submarine power cable between Azerbaijan and Romania was completed in 2025, it bypassed the old Russian energy monopoly. By carrying electricity and hydrogen, old Eastern pipeline connections are now obsolete. Europe can push for a definitive conclusion to the conflict because its physical energy transition has crossed a structural point of no return, stripping away the leverage that originally fueled the invasion. Inside the Russian Federation, the resources available to maintain the state's ambitions are running dry. The financial burden of this high-intensity war has hit a terminal breaking point. This bar chart outlines severe distortion in the nation's economy. By redirecting nearly 10% of gross domestic product into the military, the state created a vacuum in domestic investment. As military spending expands, domestic inflation breaches 15%, dragging minor economic indicators into decay. Simultaneously, the accumulated hardware resources from the Cold War, the massive Soviet-era equipment reserves, are reaching terminal depletion. The physical machinery required to project force is rusting away. When the administrative weight of a massive bureaucracy can no longer be moved by the remaining intent, the system enters a state of high entropy. The Kremlin's pivot toward negotiations is a superpower hitting its physical resource limit and seeking an exit before its internal backbone fractures under unresolved tension. The heaviest pressure pushing both Kiev and Moscow to the table is the human element. The collective will to sustain the fight is disintegrating. A society can only absorb a certain level of loss. In Ukraine, the original military doctrine calling for a total national defense has catastrophically collided with the reality of a shrinking population. This manifests as dire personnel shortages on the front line. When the feedback loop between the government's promises and the grim reality of the trenches is severed, public fatigue turns into social disorder. This area chart illustrates exactly why the military fronts have stalled. The steep divergence between the troop replenishment targets at the top and the actual dwindling recruitment numbers at the bottom, combined with rising desertion, are the exact mathematical variables forcing these talks. The war is now consuming the very resources and social structures it was meant to defend. At this level of exhaustion, the current rate of attrition has become structurally unsustainable. The peace now taking shape in Geneva offers a harsh reality check. It is a mutual surrender to systemic exhaustion. The cessation of kinetic fighting does not result in immediate stability. Instead, it triggers a different, highly volatile crisis as the systems attempt to reset under extreme pressure. Both nations now face the immense, fixed drag of demobilizing hundreds of thousands of exhausted, traumatized soldiers back into a severely fractured civilian grid. Beyond the human toll, there is a staggering environmental and administrative debt. Vast stretches of the region's most productive agricultural land are now deeply scarred. contaminated with ordnance, and requiring years of physical remediation. Attempting to inject an estimated $1.1 trillion recovery fund into a landscape of deep-seated administrative and institutional decay creates an extremely volatile situation. The fighting is stopping because the math demands it, but the ultimate test is whether a peace forced by mathematical collapse, rather than true consensus, has the structural strength to survive the aftermath. Leaders are gathering at the United Nations in Geneva to finalize a ceasefire. Looking at the architecture and the scale of the summit, it is tempting to frame this agreement as a triumph of institutional diplomacy and statecraft. But this summit is driven by physical constraints, not political compromise. The logistical cost to hold and supply the front line has simply eclipsed the economic value of any remaining disputed territory. Both sides have reached a state of strict systemic exhaustion. The physical mechanics of the war machine, the industrial output, the supply grids, the capital flows, have degraded to a point where neither side can sustain forward operations. Modern systems theory dictates that complex structures are highly sensitive to their initial conditions. A vaguely defined border or an unresolved maritime claim in this preliminary document will act as a friction point, magnifying over time until it collapses the entire peace framework. If negotiators use ambiguous language to hide their strategic intent and extract hidden advantages, the resulting treaty will be completely hollow. It will look like a stabilizing force, but it will actually carry the exact mechanisms for the next crisis. The final handshake across the table will not represent ideological alignment. It is a mutual recognition that the mechanical and systemic costs of the conflict have exceeded their capacity to pay for it. To understand exactly why the system failed, we have to look south toward the Black Sea and audit the invisible macroeconomic supply chains that forced this pause. The completion of a submarine energy corridor between Azerbaijan and Romania permanently bypassed the old European energy monopolies. By routing resources outside of legacy control, this coalition created a new structural baseline and stripped leverage away from traditional powers. At the same time, the belligerents hit a strict fiscal point of rupture. Diverting a massive percentage of gross domestic product purely toward military expenditure over several years created a deep internal economic vacuum. This chart tracks the dual-axis collapse of the war economy over a 4-year timeline. We see a sharp, volatile upward trend in domestic inflation, crossing a 15% threshold, intersecting directly with the terminal, downward slope of depleted Cold War-era hardware reserves. When skyrocketing inflation overlaps with empty armories, the system enters a state of high entropy. The war machine physically loses its ability to operate. This material deficit mirrors a breakdown on the human level. Severe personnel shortages and rising desertion rates severed the essential feedback loop between military leadership and actual conditions on the ground. The transition away from kinetic conflict initiates a highly volatile phase shift. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers must suddenly be demobilized and reintegrated into a dormant civilian workforce. Managing this massive demographic shift through a detached top-down bureaucracy, rather than mapping the process to specific local economic realities, guarantees systemic breakdown. Deep-seated administrative decay and local corruption create massive internal resistance. They distort how resources are allocated and aggravate existing local grievances. If the friction of this human reintegration is mismanaged, the resulting social disorder will create a permanent, exhausting weight on the newly formed state. Beyond social friction, the environment carries fixed costs. The physical destruction of the landscape represents a massive, long-term debt that diplomatic rhetoric cannot repair. The complete annihilation of regional industrial hubs imposes rigid mathematical constraints on how quickly the local economy can resume production. Furthermore, the soil is now loaded with unexploded ordnance and toxic heavy metals. This widespread contamination of premium agricultural land renders the historical foundation of the local economy unusable. A successful post-war architecture must calculate these unalterable environmental variables from day one. If it ignores them, the recovery system will crash upon launch. This systemic flow model shows a $1.1 trillion reservoir of international capital funneling into Ukraine's fractured administrative network. Internal friction is destructive here. Pumping billions into a decaying system simply fuels corruption, starving the recovery of necessary resources. This dynamic reflects a broader geopolitical adjustment. Global powers are calculating the exhaustion of kinetic warfare and are shifting their strategies toward the efficient management and integration of complex economic systems. The physical speed of the rebuilding effort must be strictly matched by the ethical integrity of its management. Transparency acts as the final filter to ensure capital actually translates into functional infrastructure. The true test for the international community is not signing a document to pause the fighting. It is building an authentic, highly stabilized recovery framework. Without strict integrity, the $1.1 trillion piece is merely the seed of the next systemic rupture.